Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of asking this question: is the New Testament true? We've been discussing some of that on Wednesday nights when we were able to meet publicly, but since we haven't been for the last couple weeks now, we've gone to this online video format, and so this is simply for you to follow. I hope that you've been enjoying this stuff. But last week we began talking about this concept. Did the New Testament authors tell us the truth? And this is so part 2 of kind of that answering that question. We talked last week about the first part, and we talked about two reasons we believe that the New Testament is true. There's a total of 6, and so we talked about 2 last week. And the first one was early testimony. And so we believe that there's good evidence for believing that most, if not all, of the original documents of the New Testament were written prior to 70 AD. Why is that? Well, that's when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews were dispersed, and they didn't return to their homeland until 1948, and the temple was never rebuilt. To this day, there is no Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And most of the New Testament writers were Jewish, and they wrote mostly to a Jewish audience. And so one would think that if such a cataclysmic event already took place, the New Testament authors would have had something to say about it. So, in a sense, if you think back to, I know a lot of you were either very young or hadn't been born yet when 9/11 took place, you can date a movie easily by determining if something is filmed in New York by whether or not those towers are there. If those towers are not there, then you know it took place after September 11th, 2001. If it was recorded prior to that, then you know it took place before September 11th, 2001. And so that is so this kind of cataclysmic event, if it had already taken place, you can pretty much be sure that the New Testament authors are going to have to say something about it. But in fact, what they do is they write in such a way that it seems like the temple and the temple practices are all still there. And so, as I said last week, though, the earlier a document is written, the more likely it accurately describes the events it's talking about. It doesn't guarantee accuracy, but it makes it more likely. And so the second reason for believing that the New Testament authors are telling the truth is eyewitness testimony. The New Testament writers claim either to be eyewitnesses or they're closely associated with an eyewitness to the events they describe. Of the gospel accounts, Matthew and John are both eyewitnesses. Mark and Luke are believed to write based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter and Paul. Paul writes from his own eyewitness accounts. Peter, John, Jude, and James do as well. The book of Acts contains 82 eyewitness details that have been verified through archaeology or other means of inquiry, and the book of John has over 50. The New Testament documents contain a tremendous amount of detail that would be known by eyewitnesses. So those are the two things that we talked about last week. And so this week we're going to be talking about number 3, and we call that embarrassing testimony. All right. What do we mean by embarrassing testimony? And so the proposition is this: if something is embarrassing to the author or authors, it is probably true. And this is called the principle of embarrassment. And actually, historians will use this to help determine whether a historical document is telling the truth. But why is it probably true? Let me ask you a question. Have you ever lied about something in order to make yourself look good? Of course you have. Everybody has. But now let me ask you another question. When was the last time you ever lied in order to make yourself look bad? I've never done that. Nobody does. And so when we examine the New Testament documents, they're filled with embarrassing details about the authors themselves. And these details are embarrassing not only to themselves and potentially to Jesus himself. But let's take a look at what I'm talking about. In the New Testament, the disciples are categorized or depicted as dim-witted. All right, they fail to understand what Jesus is saying. All right, let's take a look at Mark 9, verse 30 to 32. If you have a Bible, go there, grab it, pause the video, go look it up. But Mark chapter 9, verses 30 to 32, All right, it reads, "From there they went out and began to go through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know about it. For he was teaching his disciples and telling them, 'The Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later.'" But look at this last statement. "But they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him." All right. Hold on to that thought. And then let's look at the next one. Go to Luke 18, verses 31 to 34. Luke 18, verses 31 to 34. Pause this video if you have to, but let's read this. It says, "Then he took the 12 aside and said to them, 'Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things which are written through the prophets about the Son of Man will be accomplished. For he will be handed over to the Gentiles, and will be mocked and mistreated and spit upon, and after they have scourged him, they will kill him, and the third day he will rise again.'" Now, look at the last verse. "But the disciples understood none of these things, and the meaning of this statement was hidden from them, and they did not comprehend the things that were said." We're going to look at one more. Keep all this in mind real quick. We're going to look at one more. John 12, verse 16. All right, John 12, verse 16. This is the triumphal entry when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. This is what we look back to on Palm Sunday, which will be coming up in a couple of weeks. But Jesus' disciples are looking on at these events. So if you need to, go back and look through the entire chapter, get an idea for what's going on in that story. But look at what John, an eyewitness, writes about the disciples. All right, you ready? "These things his disciples did not understand at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things were written of him, and that they had done these things to him." Essentially, what is being written here is that the disciples are admitting having failed to understand what Jesus is teaching. Now, that's a great way to sell a religion, isn't it? I think so. I mean, if you're going to sell a lie, then you might as well make yourself look foolish, right? But this isn't the only thing, okay? There's more. And so the second thing is that the disciples are depicted as uncaring, okay? First, they're pictured as dim-witted. Now they're pictured as uncaring. And so the disciples actually fall asleep on Jesus at a very crucial time, twice. And so if you go to Matthew chapter 26 and read from verses 36 to 46, Jesus takes his three closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, to watch while he went and prayed. Twice he comes back only to find that his three most trusted companions have fallen asleep. Now Matthew wasn't a witness to this event, so how did he know? Right? The three men who were there must have told him. Now, what is more likely? That the three men made it up, or that they told the truth? I think they were telling the truth. In addition to this, the disciples never made an effort to give Jesus a proper burial. The guys that bury Jesus are Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They are members of the Sanhedrin, the very group that sentenced Jesus to die. And so here's the thing. If Jesus' disciples are trying to sell the people a false religion, why would they make Joseph look like the good guy while they ran and hid in fear of the Jews? Now, Jesus was buried in a Jewish tomb, all right, but why is that important? If Jesus was buried in a Jewish tomb and never resurrected, as the Christians claimed, they could have easily gone to the tomb, pulled out the body, and said, "Hey, look, he's right here, right? He hasn't risen from the dead. You got to stop all this nonsense." But if Jesus was never buried in a Jewish tomb, then the Christians would have lost credibility. The Jews could have easily said, "Jesus wasn't in one of our tombs. He never has been. Your whole story is a lie." So here's the problem. The Jews knew what kind of claims Jesus was making. In fact, if you go to Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 to 66, here's what it says. "Now on the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, 'Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, "After 3 days I am to rise again." Therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, he has risen from the dead. And the last deception will be worse than the first. All right, so get this for a second. The Jews are going to the Roman officials and asking for Roman guards to be stationed outside the tomb so that nobody can come and steal the body. All right, remember that because it's important. Pilate said to them, you have a guard, go, make it as secure as you know how. And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. So they never give him a proper burial. All right, and so they station these guys outside. Now, what I want you to know is that they go through this, but now jump forward to chapter 28, verse 11. All right, the women had arrived at the tomb where Jesus was buried, only to find that it was empty. And then they run off to tell the disciples. And then some of the guards go to the Jewish leaders to explain what had happened. The Jews pay the guards off and tell them to tell everybody else that his disciples came and stole the body in the middle of the night. All right, that's a really, really bad explanation. But why is that? First, if you were a Roman guard in the first century and you failed to do your duty, you were executed. All right, you died. Secondly, if you were a Roman guard who fell asleep on guard duty, how do you know what happened? So these things don't really make sense. So how does the Roman guards know that the Jews came, or that the disciples came and stole the body if they were asleep? And why would they be willing to admit that, knowing that their life is on the line? It's a really, really bad explanation. So what motivation then would the disciples have for stealing the body? Lie about Jesus rising from the dead when he didn't, so they could get beaten, tortured, and killed for saying that? It doesn't make any sense. Now, listen carefully. There was an ongoing argument between Jews and Christians in the first century as to what happened to Jesus' body. The Christians kept saying Jesus rose from the dead, and the Jews kept saying the disciples stole the body. But do you see what is still true here? There is still an empty tomb to deal with. And so the Jews were testifying that the tomb was empty. And the question was, what provides the best explanation for the empty tomb? And that's a subject that deserves a video all in itself. But these things are embarrassing testimonies to the disciples. But we're not through yet. There's more. The disciples are rebuked by Jesus. Now, if I'm going to make up a lie, pride keeps me from making myself look like a fool. There's no way I'm going to retell a story that makes me look like the bad guy. But in Matthew 16 and Mark 8, both of them record Peter's confession of Jesus as the Messiah. Okay? They paint Peter as such a good guy, but seconds later, Jesus predicts his death, burial, and resurrection. Peter objects, and then Jesus calls Peter Satan. All right, go look those up, go read it. It's there. Now, where does Mark get his story from? He gets it from Peter. And if I was Peter and I was retelling the story to my buddy Mark, I might be inclined to leave that part out. Yet here it is in Mark 8. Right? If this was untrue, Peter could have easily gone to Mark and say, hey, why are you painting me to look like the bad guy? That's not how it happened. You know, he could have corrected that, but here it is. In Luke 9, Jesus wants to go to Jerusalem, and he sends messengers out ahead of him. All right, and so he's going to rebuke James and John. They go to Samaria, and they're looking to prepare a place for Jesus to stay, and the Samaritans refuse to let him in. So James and John get a little hot-headed, and they ask Jesus in verse 54, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? And Jesus rebukes them and says, you don't know what kind of spirit you are of. In other words, bro, whose side are you on anyway? You don't know what you're talking about. Why would the disciples tell such embarrassing stories about themselves if none of it is true? All right. Number 4, the disciples are cowards. All right. Peter denies Jesus 3 times after claiming that he wouldn't. He says, oh, I'll never deny you, Lord. Yes, you will. Before the rooster crows, you'll do it 3 times. Peter is also rebuked by Paul in the book of Galatians. And so they had a disagreement there, and Peter was called out on it. Peter's reputation isn't a great one. And so now the question is, why would the leader of the early church allow this sort of stuff to be said about him if none of it was true? I don't think he would. Nobody does. Think about it. If you're trying to sell a lie, why would you let everybody who is also trying to sell that lie make you look bad? Right? That doesn't make any sense. Remember that when Jesus was arrested and crucified, all the disciples went and ran and hid. All right, they all ran and hid. They didn't give him a proper burial. And remember this: the New Testament is written entirely by men. All right, yet the women are depicted as the brave ones. All right, isn't that crazy? And so it was the women of the group that discovered the empty tomb, not the disciples. Now you might be asking yourself, why is that a big deal? Well, you got to understand, in that culture, the testimony of a woman was not on par with that of a man's. If you wanted to sell a lie to the culture of the day back then, you would not hang your case on the testimony of women. You just wouldn't. And back then, if you had a woman see something and a man see something, the man's testimony would be believed over the woman's testimony. And that's just how it was back then. So no Jewish man in his right mind is going to try to get other Jewish men to believe their story by saying, if you don't believe me, just go ask the women. It doesn't happen. That would never have been the case. It would be easier to sell the lie with male testimony than to tell the truth with women's testimony. And so these are many, many reasons why we believe that these guys were actually telling the truth. But there's still one more. The disciples are doubters, right? And despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. You can go to these references that are on the screen, go look them up, go read through them. And then there are some that doubted after they saw him. And so if you go to Matthew 28:17, that takes place right before the Great Commission, right? This is when Jesus is about to ascend into heaven. Okay? And so these guys have seen him, and there's still people thinking, man, is that really Jesus? No, it can't be Jesus. No, it really is Jesus. And so there are people who are doubting, right? This is what we call embarrassing testimony. If somebody is going to try to sell a lie and write all of these documents and try to suggest that Jesus is God and that he raised from the dead, why did they include so many details about them that were embarrassing to them? Why isn't it that the disciples made them look good? Why isn't it that they recount these stories as having having perfect faith? Right? Because of these things, because of the early testimony, because of the eyewitness testimony, and because of this embarrassing testimony, if it's embarrassing to the author or authors, it is more likely to be true. Because nobody makes up a story and makes themselves look bad. It just doesn't happen. But it doesn't guarantee that things are true, but it makes it very, very probable. But we're only halfway there. All right. There are still three other subjects that we're going to talk about in the next couple of videos. So stay tuned. All right, but these are very, very important things because we believe that the New Testament is true. If the New Testament is true, then so is the Old Testament, and we have to have these answers and have these intelligent conversations as to why we believe that these things are true. So stay tuned. This is not the end. We've got way more to cover, but we'll get to it week by week. I hope you guys are doing well. If you need anything, please reach out, and you guys we'll see you online next time. God bless. Take care.